Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Chodesh Tov, Agat Mechodesh.
Good Chodesh, y'all.
We are learning Mishna Pesachim, Perek Vav, Chapter 6, Mishnah Vav, Mishnah 6. Shchatai, Shleila Eichla B'Sheila Menuyav. A person shechted a carbon Pesach on Shabbos with the intention to do it for people who cannot eat it. Let's say people who are too sick or weak to eat from the carbon Pesach. B'Sheila Menuyav. Or he shechted the carbon Pesach for those who are not registered for the carbon. As we know that a carbon Pesach, you have to basically register for it, so to speak. You don't got to sign up for anything necessarily, but you have to, make up that you're going to be part of this carbon Pesach in order to partake from it. Now, if you shecht an animal, either for people who cannot eat it, those are the sole people that you're shechting it for, or you're shechting it for the people who are not registered, which is clearly what you're not supposed to be doing, but that's what you did, and you did it on Shabbos. Or la'areim la'tamein, or let's say he shechted the carbon Pesach for arelim, people who don't have a bris milah, even if they don't have the bris milah because their two brothers before them died from the bris and they are exempt from the bris milah. Nonetheless, they are arelim, they're uncircumcised, and they cannot eat from the carbon Pesach. So let's say on Shabbos you shech the carbon Pesach solely for arelim, the tamein, or you shechted the carbon Pesach solely for people who are tamei, who are impure and cannot partake of the carbon Pesach. All these are examples of people who cannot partake of this carbon Pesach, and those are the people you had in mind that you were shechting the carbon for solely. You did it on Shabbos. Chayiv. The halacha is you got to bring a carbon chatas, you got to bring a sin offering. Assuming the person did it inadvertently, for instance, in his mind, he thought he could do this on Shabbos. He knew the animal was designated as a carbon Pesach, so he thought that just the fact that it's a carbon Pesach, which he can shecht on Shabbos when Erev Pesach and Shabbos, but he thinks he could even do it for those who cannot partake from the carbon Pesach. He wasn't allowed to do that. It was unintentional, but he's not allowed to do that, and he has to bring a chatas. Chayiv means he's liable to bring a carbon chatas for what he did. You can only shecht a carbon Pesach, only slaughter an animal for a carbon Pesach on Shabbos if you're doing it right. If you're doing it wrong, then you're not allowed to. And therefore, he'd be liable for a carbon chatas or sin offering if he did it unintentionally. Next case in the Mishnah, let's say this guy who is shechting the carbon Pesach, he's doing it for both people. He's doing it for people who cannot eat from it and for people who can eat from it. For people registered on this animal for the carbon Pesach and those who are not. He did it for both. He did it for those who were circumcised and for those who were not circumcised. The Taharim and the Tameim. He did it for people who are pure and for people who aren't pure. So in all these cases, he has in mind for those who cannot partake of the carbon Pesach, but he also has in mind for those who can. Putter. In that case, he is exempt from a carbon Pesach. This is clearly something he's not supposed to be doing. Nonetheless, it's a kosher carbon. We learned previously that when you have both in mind, that the carbon Pesach is kosher. Now, just to review a little bit from previously, we also had examples of if you shech the carbon Pesach, shaloi lishma, not for its designated purpose. That carbon Pesach is invalid. So the halacha is, let's say, so let's say you had in mind that you're going to shecht it as a carbon shlomim. That would invalidate the carbon Pesach. Let's say you have in mind for this carbon Pesach, I'm doing it for shlomim and a carbon Pesach. He has both in mind. The halacha is it's a kosher carbon. As long as mistake, bad. It's no good. In the case of shaloi lishma, when you did it not for its designated purpose, and then you had in mind both, it's still invalid. And the difference is now, so there's a difference between that case of lishma and this case. When you're dealing with the designation of the animal, that relates to the animal itself, once you have in mind a invalid thought, an improper thought for the carbon, such as for a carbon shlomim, which you invalidate the carbon then, even though you had in mind also for carbon Pesach, nonetheless, it's not good. It's not a good carbon Pesach. And if that's what you did on Shabbos, you'd be liable to carbon chatas. Here, where we're not talking about the animal itself, we're talking about the things outside of the animal, those who can eat it. Now, again, that can invalidate the animal if that's all you had in mind for. But when you're dealing with things that are, so to speak, outside of the animal, and validations that are outside of the animal, as long as you shechted it with the intent of those who could partake, that it's still kosher. That's why in this case we say you're pater, you're exempt from bringing a carbon chatas in this case. Next, shchatai. You slaughter the animal. Again, we're all talking about on Shabbos. It was Erev Pesach Shabbos. You slaughter the animal for your carbon Pesach, v'nimitza balmum, and you see that it has a blemish. There are certain outward blemishes on the outside of the animal that are validated for a carbon. Now, when you shechted the carbon, you had not noticed that blemish, but then afterwards you realize it was blemished. In that case, so again, it comes out that's not a good carbon. That's not a good carbon Pesach. Chayim, in that case, you'd be liable to bring a sin offering. You know, it was unintentional, bringing an animal, shechting an animal with a blemish. Nonetheless, he's got to bring a sin offering. However, let's say you shechted the animal, and then you found that inwardly it was a treifa. Inwardly, it had a wound, an inner wound that makes the animal a treifa. It means it's going to cause the animal to die within a year. That gives it the status of a treifa. You're not allowed to eat it, not allowed to bring it as a carbon. So now, what happened is there are certain signs of being a treifa that are only on the inside. Let's say the lung is punctured. You only can know about that after you shech the animal. You shech the animal, you cut it open, and check it inside. So if let's say what happened was it was Shabbos, Erev Pesach, you shechted the carbon Pesach, you checked it, and it comes out that inwardly, the seiser means hidden, inwardly, privately, it's a treifa. And so it comes out that there's not a good carbon Pesach. So again, I slaughtered the animal, and it's not a good carbon Pesach. Nonetheless, putter, you are exempt from being a carbon chatas in that case. Why? Because there is such a thing called shogeg, unintentional, such a thing called ones. Ones means it was beyond your control. It was unavoidable. There is no way to know about this animal being a treifa inwardly without checking the animal first. And therefore, since, again, it's Shabbos, it's Erev Pesach Shabbos, this is your carbon Pesach, you shech. That's what you're supposed to do. There's nothing more you can do other than shech. If it comes out now that it becomes a treifa, which means it wasn't a good animal, you couldn't use it for the carbon Pesach, but that was unavoidable. It was beyond your control. When that happens, you're exempt from a sin offering from a carbon chatas. But the blemish on the outside, it was unintentional. I missed it, but you shouldn't have missed it. You're able to check, and you should check it well. And if you missed it, that means you didn't check it well. That's called shogeg. That's called unintentional. And then you're chayiv a carbon chatas. Then you got to bring a sin offering. So the difference between the blemish and the internal wound is the fact that the blemish is something you should have caught. It was unintentional, you didn't do it on purpose, but it wasn't unavoidable. You should have caught it. Therefore, you got to bring a carbon chatas, a sin offering. But something that's beyond your control and therefore unavoidable, that is something you don't have to bring a sin offering or carbon chatas for.
But nevertheless, it was invalid.
Correct. Now, shchatai. You shechted the carbon Pesach. And then you found out that all the people who registered took themselves off. The halacha is that as long as the carbon Pesach, the animal for the carbon Pesach, has not yet been slaughtered, hasn't been shechted, all the people who registered can say, I'm going on a different one. They can leave it. Now, if you leave it to the point that there's no one registered on it anymore, then it's not valid. So in this case...
Including yourself?
I would assume if you're doing it for other people.
Doing it strictly for
You're doing it for other people, yes. Shchatai. You slaughtered the animal. V'noida, then it became known, shabash chabayla mesyadam, which literally means the owners pulled back their hands. They unregistered from this animal. They left this animal going to a different one. Oishamesu, or the owners died. Oishanitmu, or they became impure. So you didn't know any of these things, right? And you found out afterwards. Pot, you're exempt. Why? You're exempt from a carbon chatas, from a sin offering. This is called slaughtering it with permission. That means you are not responsible to find out before you slaughter an animal, is there still somebody involved in this carbon Pesach? I'm assuming the explanation is because it's something uncommon to expect that whoever registered, everybody left it, or everybody died, or everybody became impure.
Everyone we're mad at
it's not so common. And therefore, to expect a person before he slaughters it to find out that there's no one left on the card, whether there's someone left on the carbon or not, is not something expected. Therefore, it falls under the category of oinus, something that was unavoidable. And therefore, even though it comes out, you slaughter the animals, had a good carbon pesach, but since it was unavoidable to you not to slaughter the carbon pesach, there was no way of knowing that you shouldn't be doing it. Therefore, you're exempt from a carbon chatas, from a sin offering. Have a wonderful day. Again, Chodesh Tov, a good Chodesh.
What happens with the